Well, we've done it. We've reached the end of history. Well, people have talked about the end of history in the past, imagining that history would stop. But of course, history has this tendency to keep rolling on. But we're at the end of at least the history we're going to be studying of the Jewish experience globally. I sometimes will make a joke and say that humanistic Judaism and Jewish studies more generally in the academic world is a non-profit organization. That is, we don't believe in prophecy or that you can predict the future. But even rabbinic theology agreed with us. Traditional rabbinic theology said that prophecy ended. It had a point, it was alive, and then it stopped. It ended with Malachi, supposedly the last of the prophets, at least in the Hebrew Bible organization. The New Testament prophet organization is slightly different for ideological reasons as well. However, the rabbis also felt that there was something to be gained by looking back at what had already been revealed. You could find insight into the present and maybe into the future by studying the sources of the past. You could read the Torah, you could read the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and find insight into your own day by learning about what had been revealed before. And so in some ways it's parallel to us, although we don't necessarily believe that Jewish history has a divine author, as the rabbis imagined for the Hebrew Bible. For us to understand the Jewish present, we need to know how we got here, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to infallible predictions for the Jewish future. So if we think about it in the big picture, what are some things that are new about Jewish life today compared to the sweep of history? Well, if nothing else, in many parts of the world, Jews are experiencing historically high levels of tolerance. Now, we may not feel as secure as we might have felt 30 years ago with the rise of white nationalism in America, a resurgent anti-Semitism in Europe, and of course in the Arab world as well. We may not feel as secure as we once did, but on historical metrics, we're doing pretty well still. On the level of tolerance, of freedom of religious practice, the ability to be visibly Jewish. Again, there are challenges here and there, but on a historical scale, certainly much better than it was in the 19th century in Europe or in the 13th century with the Almohad invasion of medieval Spain. We're doing pretty well compared to those levels. One of the reasons why we're doing so well is this new concept that emerged at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, this idea of becoming a citizen, having rights, the idea of Jews having individual rights, or even rights that were enshrined into permanent law as opposed to a temporary arrangement with the local dukedom. I mean, this was radical, at least for the European Jewish experience. You did have the concept of a Pact of Omar in the Islamic world, where there were more permanent safeguards, but they were always subject to local interpretation. And if the local caliph decided the Jews were getting too uppity and needed to be put down, then they would be. But now that we have this concept of rights, I mean, I made the point to people when we had a couple of synagogue attacks in the last few years, how different things are now. They said it's like Kristallnacht all over again. And I said, well, except for the fact that in Kristallnacht, it was the police burning the synagogues. And today, the police are protecting the synagogues because of that revolution in Jewish rights and rootedness and citizenship. And that's radically new compared to the sweep of Jewish history. I mean, there were occasional Jewish citizens of the Roman Empire, but that was the exceptional circumstance, like a Josephus. But it was nothing like what we've experienced today. Another major change we're experiencing is we're swimming in a secular sea. You know, much of Western Europe, even large parts of America, certainly urbanized, college-educated America, is way more secularized than the Jewish environment has ever been. And so living in a world where religion and government are separated, where intellectual pursuits are often done without reference to divine authority, leads to all kinds of changes in Jewish life. You know, it was very easy to believe that Moses wrote the Torah when everyone believed that Moses wrote the Torah, including Muslims and Christians. So you had to be a total heretic to all traditions to not think that Moses wrote the Torah. But today, when almost no academic departments of Jewish studies or history or archaeology would support Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible exactly as recorded by tradition, it's respectable to have that perspective. It's even respectable to build a Jewish identity and community around that perspective. So our secularism as secular and humanistic Jews is in some ways a kind of assimilationist mood. We're becoming like the society around us. rather than becoming, maintaining our difference as we used to. Another difference we have today within the Jewish community is a shift from plurality to pluralism. So we've seen throughout our study, there have been many examples of Jewish plurality where there were many ways to be Jewish. We saw the Second Temple period with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Hellenistic Jews. And we saw in the Maccabees the battles between the Hellenizing Jews and the more pietistic, traditionalist, fundamentalist Jews. We had the battles between Jewish mysticism and Jewish rationalism and philosophy. We had the Rabbinites and the Karaites. We've had in our own last few centuries the denominations of Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. Well, those were all pluralities where there were multiple options, but they all hated each other and they didn't accept each other as legitimate. What we found today, at least in some circles, is an ideology of pluralism, which means you believe in the goodness and the benefit of having multiple Jewish options available. And in some ways, the equal validity of multiple Jewish options. You think of them as multiple streams, not as a hierarchy, but multiple streams or multiple flavors of Judaism. And who's to say that poppy seed is better than raisin? I mean, I would say that poppy seed is better than raisin, but I can't argue that someone else might taste that difference very differently. So the reality is that we've shifted from a plurality of many options that don't like each other or don't recognize each other to a kind of pluralistic view, at least from the modern Orthodox through humanistic Jewish spectrum. Again, the ultra-Orthodox don't accept anybody past their right, and some individuals or communities or rabbis in the more traditional denominations might not look fondly on us, but by and large, the Jewish community has accepted a kind of pluralism that was, again, unthinkable before modern times. One of the other advances or radical changes in our environment today is that we live in a world of freedom. We've separated religious belief and practice from a Jewish ethnic and cultural identity, where before modern times, that religio-ethnic identity was indissoluble. And to join the people, you had to join the religion. And if you left the religion, you left the people. There was no space in between. Spinoza had nowhere to go. There was no Jewish community center. He could go to the pool, there was no options for him. But now we have the option of choosing what we do. And even within established communities, congregations, people are making their own choices of whether or not they follow Shabbat and in which ways. Are they kosher style versus fully kosher? Or are they kosher at home, but not out when they go out to eat, or vice versa? Again, that pick and choose approach is a radically new circumstance that is the fruit of freedom that we experience today. I'll also highlight something radically new about Jewish life today is the full and inclusive involvement of women in every level of Jewish life. Before even the second half of the 20th century, women rabbis were unheard of. The first woman rabbi appears in the 1930s during the pre-Holocaust and Holocaust period. Her name is Regina Jonas in Germany, but she's almost totally forgotten until the archives are opened in East Germany in the 1990s. The first American Reform rabbi who's Jewish is Sally Priesand in 1972. So before that, as far as people knew, because Regina Jonas had been forgotten, there had been no women rabbis. And now over half of the rabbinic students at the Reform, Reconstructionist, and Conservative seminaries and our own humanistic seminary are women. And that's going to continue to have a large rippling impact on the organized Jewish community. But women can participate in minyans. They can be witnesses on ketubas. They can be rabbis. They can be presidents of congregation. This is unprecedented in Jewish life. I remember once I saw a wonderful clip from Ken Burns' documentary on baseball. And they asked a Black American writer about baseball, when was the best era in baseball history? And he said, well, it has to be now. Because you can't say it was the 1930s with the Bronx Bomber Yankees, because a large part of the best players were not allowed to play. How could you say it was the best ever back then? It has to be now with the global influx of players from all over the world who are contributing their talents. And I would argue the same is true for Jewish life. The best time of Jewish life could not have been Rashi's era or the Talmudic era or Maimonides' period, because half of the potential contributors to Jewish life were silenced. Were unable to even learn the rabbinic sources, let alone participate in creating them and deciding what Jewish life could be like. So women's participation in leadership, a radical change from the past compared to today. And lastly, I'm talking to you on Zoom. I printed out my notes on a printer. I used the computer to read. It's the world of technology. You know, being able to go to a website that has not only the Hebrew and English text of the Bible, but also it's searchable by keyword. And once you pull up a verse, it'll pull up all the commentaries and all the traditional sources accessible at a moment. That was unthinkable before modern times. You had to discipline yourself to study and learn over and over again. You had volumes of books on the wall to reference to just find one commentary on one quote from one passage in the Bible. I mean, remember, the earliest rabbinic sages of the Mishnah were called the Tanaim, which means the repeaters, because they had memorized the rabbinic law. And they would be repeating the chapters as a way to, it was called the oral law, it was memorized. And they would cite the Bible for memory, and sometimes wrong, for memory. Now we have books printed by the thousands, we have ebooks printed by the who knows how many, and we have the resources of technology to make Jewish life different, more accessible in some ways, and certainly much more creative in its requirements and its mediums. I mean, I'll give you one other example. You know, you used to rely on the rabbi for answers to everything. You know, remember in the beginning of Fiddler on the Roof, where they're saying, Rabbi, is there a blessing for the czar? And Rabbi, is there a blessing for the sewing machine? They want the rabbi to give them all the truths. But these days, anybody with one of these things thinks they know everything, because it's all handy if you just ask for Alexa or Siri or anyone else to help you. I'm just making sure mine didn't turn on. Okay. It records me enough without that. So the point is that this world of technology also has been a radical revolution in Jewish life. Now, with all that said, of all the changes that have taken place, there's also important continuities with the Jewish past, things that are similar. In fact, many of the challenges I referenced are not all new. You know, that question of how far do we integrate and how do we maintain our difference? The Maccabees were talking about that, right? They were debating, should we circumcise or not? How much Greek should we learn? Initially, they hated the Greeks, and the Maccabees themselves took on Greek names, and the books of Maccabees are saved in Greek, not in Hebrew. You know, it was seductive and inevitable. We still grapple with the issue of the diaspora and the centralization process. Remember, diaspora starts even before the temple was destroyed. So that pull of foreign places and the pull of the homeland is still a dialogue that we go through today. And even in our diasporas that we have now, there has been a kind of centralization where you don't get as many of the far-flung tiny Jewish communities in random small towns that you did maybe 100 years ago. Now it's become concentrated. So the Jews of small town South, for example, in America, are now largely in Atlanta, in Memphis. You know, they've moved to the big cities rather than the small towns where they ran the small department stores and so on. That concentration has happened on the small scale, but also, of course, on the big national scale, such that something like 80% of the world's Jews are either in the United States or in Israel. Just in those two countries, you have 80% of the world's Jews. That was, again, unthinkable before the founding of the modern state of Israel, and even for many decades after the founding of the modern state of Israel, that level of concentration was just not there. And finally, another piece of continuity that we should recognize is that major elements of Jewish culture have stayed the same. The Bible we have today is still the Tanakh that the rabbis canonized 2,000 years ago. Many of the holidays that we still celebrate are the holidays that are defined in the book of Leviticus, which was written probably 2,500 years ago, even if we celebrate them differently. The names are the same, some of the meanings are the same, some of the stories we tell are the same, even some of the passages that we read are the same. The four questions that appear, well, not the four questions, the four sons in the Passover Haggadah who ask different questions, the very questions they ask in the Haggadah are asked in the biblical sources. They say, well, your son will come to you and ask you, what do you mean by all of this? That's the same question they ask in the Haggadah that's asked by we say four children, not four sons, but we're still asking similar questions. And we'll be talking more in the fall about Jewish culture more specifically, talking about Jewish literature, holidays, and so on. So if you want to learn more about that, you can come back in the fall and we'll be exploring more on Jewish culture, its evolution, and also its celebration today. Now, we do face some challenges in the modern period. There's the challenge of unity and uniformity. How much do we have to be alike with other Jews to have a unity of purpose and advocacy? What are the minimal things we have to agree on? Just this week, you might have known, there was a bill proposed in the US House of Representatives that wanted to require Israel to provide transparency and regular reporting on whether any of the funding that the US was sending to Israel was being used for detention of Palestinian children or demolition of Palestinian homes or other issues like that. And it provoked a real split in the American Jewish community, because some of the more liberal Jewish groups like J Street or Teruah, which is a rabbinic organization for human rights, they support that bill because they're opposed to Israel doing those kind of things on the basis of human rights. But AIPAC and the Zionist Organization of America, who are more center-right to right-wing Israel advocacy organizations, are very opposed to that bill because they feel like it's the first step to making aid to Israel conditional as opposed to unconditional aid, which they would prefer Israel to receive. So it's provoked a split within the Jewish community. And the question is, what will happen the next time there's an organization meeting of major Jewish organizations? Are they going to agree to stand together against anti-Semitism, for example, when they can't even agree on what the definition of anti-Semitism is? Because some see any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. Others require it to have a very high level of resonance with traditional anti-Semitic tropes to count, and they don't agree. And there's a gap there where the consensus that might have existed 30 or 40 years ago in the American Jewish world vis-a-vis the Holocaust, vis-a-vis Israel, that may be breaking down. And we'll have to see how uniform we need to be to have a unity of purpose and how we find that balance. A second challenge that we'll have to grapple with is how much do we modernize? There's a lot of words that are thrown around when it comes to Jews becoming like the people around them. We used to use the phrase the melting pot. In fact, it was a Jewish author who wrote a play called The Melting Pot. His name was Israel Zangwill. And it imagined that all these different Americans came into the country and they were put into a pot and they melted together, and then they became this new alloy called American. But other scholars thought, that's not exactly what happens, and maybe that's not a good thing. And so they came up with another analogy. It was the vegetable soup analogy. If you put different ingredients into a vegetable soup, they all contribute something to the broth of the whole, but they maintain some of their own integrity. And it depends on what you put in and how long it's in there. So you drop a tomato in, it's going to last not as long as a carrot will last in your vegetable soup. And you put a rock in there, it's not going to contribute a lot to the soup, but it's also going to last a long time. So you think about the Amish, or you think about the ultra-Orthodox and their set-apart communities like New Square in outstate New York. They're the rock in the vegetable soup. They're not contributing much to the whole, but they are not dissolving either. On the other hand, peoples that have been here for a long time, who have generally white skin, and so it's easier for them to integrate, they may be more like the tomato, that after too long of a generation or generations in the soup, maybe they're not as much around anymore or very hard to find. But they've contributed a lot to the soup. So what are we talking about when we're talking about Jews living with the surrounding culture? Are they assimilating in the sense of vanishing out into the other people? Are they acculturating? Are they becoming sort of culturally similar to the people around them? By the way, that happened all over in Jewish history, where Jews in Yemen dressed like Yemenites, and Jews in Poland dressed like Polish nobility, and Jews in Iraq dressed like Iraqis. In fact, periodically, the non-Jewish authorities would have to put in rules marking Jews as different visually and by dress, because the Jews were dressing like everybody else. Jewish food is very different in different parts of the Jewish world, because Jews have always acculturated to the world around them. How far do we integrate, and how much difference do we maintain from the surrounding culture? Well, there's not going to be one answer to that that's going to work for everybody. And the various denominations we have in some way are a representation of differing levels of integration with the surrounding culture. Maybe we in the secular humanistic world are more integrated with the surrounding culture, except for the fact that we're secular and humanistic, where the surrounding culture in America tends to be more religious. So maybe the Reform Jews are the most integrated because they're most English speaking, following dress and diet patterns. and yet they have a conventional monotheistic ethical religion that fits in with the general Protestant ethos. Of course, even that's changing in the surrounding culture as fewer and fewer people are members of traditional Christian Christian churches and institutions. So I want to finish my opening presentation, then we'll have plenty of time to discuss, with three big picture takeaways from the sweep of Jewish history that we've covered this year. The first lesson I hope you've gotten is that change is the Jewish tradition. We've gone from polytheism to monotheism. We've gone from worshiping at one temple in Jerusalem to thousands of synagogues around the world with very different cultures and architectures and styles and ritual practices. We've gone from animal sacrifice to verbal prayer and Torah study and doing good deeds as the metric of Jewish behavior, of doing Jewish. We've gone from living only in a homeland. We were the Judeans of Judea. That's where Jew came from. Then we lived exclusively or almost exclusively in diaspora with a very, very small presence in the land of Israel relative to the diaspora. And now we live in a world with both diaspora and a strong presence in our historic homeland. We've seen the extremes from Maimonidean philosophy to Kabbalistic mysticism, and we've gone from a core religio-ethnic identity with a core set of beliefs and practices to the wide diversity of Jewish identities we find out there in the world today. So if nothing else, change is the Jewish tradition, and that you can't necessarily predict what Jewishness will be like 100 years from now. I mean, take yourself back 100 years to 1921. Could you have guessed at the Holocaust, the founding of the modern state of Israel, the slamming down of possibilities for Jewish life in the Soviet Union, which had just been founded, but there were a lot of hopes that this could provide an avenue for secular Yiddish culture, a la the Bund, to get root and get recognition as part of the socialist family of ideology. The American Jewish community, most of it was recently arrived immigrants who it wasn't clear they would assimilate, and they were largely speaking Yiddish. And the Jewish Daily Forward was still all in Yiddish, not even adding English pages to its pages yet. So who could have guessed what Jewish life would have been like? And intermarriage was almost non-existent for the American Jewish community 100 years ago. And now it represents a substantial part of our extended Jewish family. So we couldn't have guessed where we were going 100 years ago. I have no idea where we'll be 100 years from now, but I can guarantee you it will be different than what we are today. A second takeaway in the big picture is that the Jews are not the chosen people at the center of history. Now, if you read the Bible, it believes very clearly the Jews are the chosen select elite of Yahweh, the universal God who controls everybody else. So when the Jews lose in battle or in war, it's because God wanted them to lose. He was punishing them by bringing the Assyrians and by bringing the Syrian Greeks and bringing the Romans. They were doing it wrong. And so the way to fix it is to do what Yahweh wants you to do, and otherwise he will cause history to revolve and crush you in its gears. That's not how we understand history working. There are a lot of factors that go into historical events, some personal choice, some larger economic or climate factors that may influence why armies move the way they do and what they conquer. The Jews were at a crossroads between empires, and they happened to have a window in that early monarchy period when Egypt was destabilized and Mesopotamia with Babylonia and Assyria was destabilized by invaders from the outside. That created the window to create the beginnings of a separate Jewish civilization not conquered by either Egypt or Babylonia, which were the much stronger territories because of agricultural surplus. We've seen plenty of stories of suffering and expulsion, totally disconnected from how pious the Jewish community was and how actively they prayed. The Crusaders who killed Jews in Central Europe on their way to the Holy Land for the Crusades, those were some of the most pious Jews around. They allowed themselves to be murdered or committed suicide rather than convert to what they considered idolatry. The Jews killed in the Chmielnicki pogroms in Eastern Europe in 1648. The Jews killed in the Holocaust in Poland. Many of them were ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic, pious Jews. They died by the tens and hundreds of thousands, independent of their piety and practice. And we've also found other peoples with similar experiences. If nothing else, Chinese and Hindu culture goes back at least as long as we have recorded Jewish culture, and they're still around. And frankly, if you're measuring success by the number of people who follow this tradition, they are doing way better than we are. Talk about your offspring will number like the stars of the sky. Well, the Chinese and Hindus are doing better than the Jews. But there are other people who have also lived in diaspora, who've also lived with a roaming culture. Think of the Roma people, or historically called gypsies, or the Armenians, who just had their genocide recognized this past week by President Joe Biden. The Armenians live in many countries. They are multilingual. They have special commercial skills. They have a homeland that was recently reestablished, and most of them continue to live outside of the homeland. They like the idea of Armenia, but most of them are happy to live outside of Armenia, but maintaining their Armenian-ness. And by the way, many Armenians that I've met are very secularized. Even if they have the Armenian church as their official ethnic institution, their personal practice and belief has tended to become much more secularized. So how did the Jews survive? Why did they survive? Well, it was a combination of luck and human skill and determination. They had useful skills like literacy, like international commercial contacts. They were flexible in their practice at times. They were mobile and were willing to move to a new place rather than simply stay and convert. They would move and be able to reestablish their roots in new places. They were stubborn and they refused to give in. And now there were Jews who did convert, we know, over the centuries, both to Christianity and to Islam, but a lot of Jews were very stubborn. You know, the Bible says we're a stiff-necked people. Or if you take Henny Youngman's version, he said, some people think he's a pain in the neck. Others have a lower opinion of him. So maybe that's what other people thought of us too, that we were pains in the tuchus instead of pains in the neck, but our stubbornness did help us to survive. And I will say that in an era of persecution, we had a self-conception as the chosen people, the elite with the special revelation from God. And that was a survival strategy in a period of relentless persecution. But I hope you understood when I was talking about what was new in Jewish life today, that the old survival strategies that worked in the ancient or medieval worlds may not be adapted to the new circumstances in which we find ourselves. You know, there's that famous sort of visual experiment that was done with different colored moths during the Industrial Revolution, where before the Industrial Revolution, you had moths that were dark and moths that were light, and they would be in sort of equal proportions because they could hide in different shadows or sunlight areas and they wouldn't be caught by the birds. But with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution and the layering of black soot falling over everything, the white ones were dead meat because they were easily found. When you have a new environmental circumstance, you need new survival strategies. And so because that old survival strategy of chosenness and eliteness and separateness was successful in the pre-modern period, doesn't mean it's a good fit today. In fact, for many people who have seen the attractions of freedom and secularization and modernization and gone to university, they see this chosenness stuff and they think, ugh, that's elitist, maybe it's even racist, it's certainly chauvinist, it's too tribalist for me, I'm more of a universalist, yuck. And so if the choice is to be Jewish only in a tribalist, chauvinist way, or to be a universalist, some people will choose the universalist. They'll say, I'm just a citizen of the world. And if we have versions of Jewishness that are particular, that are different and distinct, but not contradictory to a universal ethic of care and concern, maybe those are more adapted to this environment in which we find ourselves now. And the last big picture point, and it was an underlying principle of the entire class in every era. Real history makes a great story. Why do we teach this to adults and to our kids in our Sunday school? Well, one reason is, as the X-Files used to say, the truth is out there. They're going to find it. They'll take a class in Jewish history at university. They'll find a YouTube video. And if we tell them that the Garden of Eden is real and that Noah's flood is real and that Abraham is historical and that the Exodus happened exactly the way it says in the Bible, they're going to find evidence that suggests otherwise. And if, on the other hand, we make that part of our understanding of what it means to be Jewish and to know our people's story, then it's already part of their sense of being part of the Jewish people. They don't have a cognitive dissonance between what they were told, aka lied to about, as they might say, and what they think really happened and what scholarship, what human knowledge thinks really happened. So first, the truth is out there, and better to inoculate with some truth than to give the fable and hope they never encounter the truth that may be there. And secondly, our approach to doing Jewish history, studying this Jewish story, makes the Jewish saga a very human story. It's a tale of human tragedy and human triumph. It's a Jewish journey through the days and places of the real lived Jewish experience. To be honest, you can keep your floods and your parting of the Red Seas in the literature department. But the real and partial and still being discovered history of the Jewish people, that's the story that we find fascinating and that we've been telling this whole year.